Hello, I'm sitting here in my room in Chico, in California, in the United States of America, the country where I live and where I immigrated to in 1999. I'm so happy to be here. America is such a great country, and I'm glad that I have been able to go here and to live here with my wife, Bonnie. And we're having such a good time. And specifically for me, I have gone through such an enormous development while being here, while being challenged, while being, you could say, also troubled, yeah, by many of the circumstances that I have endured. But nevertheless, I have absorbed all these circumstances and all these situations that I have survived. And I have developed languageology, the science of spoken language, in which we address the enormous difference between disembodied language and embodied language, in which disembodied language signifies that we base our use of language, so we're talking about how we use our language. In disembodied language, we use our language in a wrong way because we do not listen to ourselves while we speak. And in embodied language, we use our language correctly because we listen to ourselves while we speak. So the writing, I've got another piece of writing that I did this morning. I'm going to read to you about, it is about the correct versus the incorrect way of using language. I know this is a big deal, and I know many people will be inclined to say, like, who are you to say this? Well, I am the expert on languageology, the science of spoken language. And I've explored this topic for the last 45 years. That's who I am. And I know for sure that this difference, which I have identified, is of enormous importance. And the fact that we refuse to acknowledge this is to our own detriment. So, here is my writing. Astonishingly, even the most educated people and the people who are presumably the most sophisticated, they refuse to acknowledge the profound difference between not listening to themselves while they speak and listening to themselves while they speak. It is this difference between disembodied language, the incorrect way of using language, and embodied language, the correct way of using language. That is what I'm talking about. It is utterly simple, I know. Yet it is completely ignored. And consequently, we are, per default, engaging in disembodied language, in the incorrect way of using language, worldwide. And we are unable to deliberately, skillfully, and continuously engage in what I have, embodied language. I listen to myself while I speak. If embodied language happens at all, because it sometimes still happens a little bit, just minimally, just a moment, a glimpse. If it happens at all, it is pure coincidence. It is just because the situation is positive, yeah. And it is also because we do have a real self-nature, yeah. When I say here inside my chest, right, somewhere on the left side here, there's my heart inside my chest. I'm not imagining that my heart is there. If you would be a heart surgeon and you open my chest cavity, you will find my heart there. Yeah, that's not imaginary. No. So there is a real aspect about who we are as organisms. We breathe. Yeah, we must have oxygen. And we must have food and water to sustain our biological functions. Yes, and all that is part of our self-nature. And when we are faced with a threat, or when we perceive there to be some kind of a threat, we have a particular nervous system, an autonomic nervous system, which will go into a fight, flight, or freeze response if we are exposed to some sort of threat, or if we perceive to be threatened. If, however, we are experiencing a non-aversive environment, we do not have that kind of autonomic reactivity. And yes, then we are able to have embodied language, the correct way of using language. So I might as well just say that this embodied language is tied to the autonomic reactivity which relates to a perceived or a real threat. So if embodied language happens at all, it is because our true self-nature is still there, even though we do not have the language to express it properly. So this is our problem. Our self-nature is real, our autonomic nervous system does what it does, but our language is not congruent with our autonomic responses. If it would be, then we would experience that it is true, disembodied language happens in an aversive contingency, an aversive environment in which we are, in one way or another, experiencing the dissociative effects of this fight, flight, fear response, and this, you could say, learned helplessness situation, because we cannot escape from that situation as long as we haven't acknowledged our participation in disembodied language. So we, with our language, create and recreate that same situation over and over again. So, as I was saying, if embodied language happens, and it does happen, just a few seconds, just a moment, just a brief breathing moment, a real moment of authenticity, then we experience our self-nature. Because it cannot be denied all the time, in spite of our inability to capture it accurately with our language. And we all experience these short-lived moments, regardless of our horrible behavior. Yeah? So it doesn't matter whether we are murderers, it doesn't matter whether we are brutal dictators, it doesn't matter whether we are abusive people or addicted or mentally ill. Yeah, that is another phenomenon that will be completely differently described once we have embodied language. But regardless of our life experience and regardless of how badly we behave, let me put it this way, we still all experience these moments of relative happiness, relative peacefulness, a sense of well-being which suddenly shines through because of, you could say, desirable circumstances, because of situations in which we have fun, in which we enjoy, in which we feel free, in which we are aware, in which we can be who we are and feel safe and feel accepted. And yes, of course, there are complications there because we can force people to accept us. We can control the situation in such a way that what we do is, true, or we cannot be questioned. And all of that creates complications with regards to our true nature, which is in conflict with our own obsessive, compulsive, distrustful and defensive and whatnot, pretentious behavior. Yeah. So if embodied language happens at all, it is because our self-nature cannot be denied all the time. It still shines through in spite of no matter how horrible people we are, it still is there. Yeah, and it never goes away because it is the truth of who we actually are, even though it's covered up by our actions and particularly by our way of dealing with language, our incorrect way of dealing with language. So we all experience these short-lived moments of happiness and peacefulness, but we do not create and maintain the circumstances in which these positive experiences are possible with our language. Yeah, we do not know how to do that. We do not know how to use our language correctly because that involves speaking with ourselves and listening to ourselves. So we do not create and maintain the circumstances in which embodied language happens. No, we do not create and maintain the situation in which our well-being is prolonged. Actually, this is where it gets really interesting, I find. Actually, sometimes we are, without realizing this, we are creating these positive circumstances. And then, again, at other times, actually most of the time, actually almost all the time, we are creating circumstances in which only negative experiences begin to occur. So we are semi-permanently involved in disembodied language, in the incorrect use of language, which derives from the fact that we do not listen to ourselves while we speak. But once we know the difference between disembodied language and embodied language, we recognize that creating negative experiences with our language, if we recognize the difference between disembodied language and embodied language, then we become aware, like, wow, so our language creates these negative experiences. That's based on incorrect use of language. And creating positive experiences, that is, of course, the correct way of using language. Did you just hear what I said? Do I need to repeat it? Once we know the difference between disembodied language and embodied language, we recognize that creating negative experiences with our language is the incorrect way of using language. And creating positive experiences, that is the correct way of using language. It is so self-evident because each of us is on the receiving end of how we use our language. Each of us individually experiences the consequences of either our incorrect or our correct way of using language. There's no way around that. And the fact that this truth continues to be hidden from us is caused by one thing and one thing only. We don't listen to ourselves while we speak. Once we speak with ourselves instead of with each other, this colossal mistake is finally coming into focus. When we don't like what we hear ourselves say, we know we engage in disembodied language because there's no one else to blame than ourselves. And why would we blame ourselves? Well, you can go on with that for a while. Doesn't work either. That's more of the same disembodied language. So the issue of blaming ourselves is still likely to continue for some time, but if we continue to speak, and if we keep reminding ourselves that in spite of all our horse shit nonsense that we keep saying, we know we have already said something in the past that was good. We know we have already said something once in a blue moon that was kind of relieving, kind of liberating, kind of relaxing, kind of truthful, useful, realistic, humorous, yes. And inevitably, if we just keep on talking with ourselves and reminding ourselves of these few instances that we were able to do that, we will be saying something which is again in line with, yes, you guessed it, it is in line with the correct use of language, embodied language, in which we, even if it is ever so briefly, in which we express our individually lived experience satisfyingly, honestly, and perhaps surprisingly. The problem, obviously, is not that we are incapable of talking with ourselves, or that we cannot listen to ourselves, or that we are unable to admit that there is actually a correct way and an incorrect way of using language to generate these positive outcomes. That's not the problem. The problem is that we keep talking with others, not with ourselves. Actually, even if we would talk with ourselves, yeah, even if we would talk with ourselves, as long as we keep producing negative experiences for ourselves. So, for instance, if we keep blaming ourselves, yeah, that something is wrong and that I don't know, we're just being hard on ourselves. We're our own worst enemy. But as long as we keep producing negative experiences for ourselves with our language, we are, apparently, we're still talking with others, it seems, even while we are alone with ourselves. Because why are we beating ourselves up? However, if we withstand the temptation to talk with others, and if we keep talking with ourselves by reminding ourselves that we are alone, we are talking with ourselves, we are listening to ourselves, we can't help but hear that once we begin to listen to ourselves and talk with ourselves in such a way, that listening to ourselves become possible, then we talk with ourselves about, once we talk with ourselves, then we suddenly feel positive. But when we talk with ourselves about others, we are being negative to ourselves. But when we talk with ourselves and leave everyone out of it, we are being positive to ourselves. Isn't that interesting? So, if we are able to achieve this, that we leave everybody out of it, and we just keep doing that. We keep saying like, no, I'm not going to talk with others. I'm not going to talk about others. I'm only going to be talking about myself. We find out that we get the positive consequences. It's so beautiful how that works. But as soon as other people are coming in, and as soon as we begin to consider other people, and we are going to also just, of course, look at ourselves or listen to ourselves as if we're listening to through somebody else's ears, the judgments that we have about ourselves, because we have been judged, of course, we are creating negative outcomes for ourselves. So whenever we somehow manage the latter, that we are creating these positive outcomes, we are cleansing ourselves in a bath of embodied language. And after this wonderful bath of self-reinforcing embodied language, we feel so refreshed and so rejuvenated and charged with energy. And all of that is because even if it was just temporarily, we have been able to engage in embodied language with ourselves. We have spoken with ourselves and used the correct way of using language, the self-reinforcing way of using language. And the incorrect way of using language, that was a form of self-punishment. That's what disembodied language is. So, as we discover the difference between not listening and listening to ourselves while we speak, we are able to finally understand that our disembodied language isn't merely just a bad habit or a momentary lapse of judgment. No, it is a deeply ingrained, conditioned pattern of how we use our language, which sets the stage for all our other behaviors. So, disembodied language, it truly is the language of self-sabotage, which is practiced in a desperate attempt to externalize our psychological pain. Yeah, that too. So we are self-sabotaging. We are using disembodied language in an attempt to get rid of negative experiences. But that's not how it works. Because we fail to recognize, by talking with ourselves, by listening to ourselves, and by hearing ourselves, we fail to recognize that we, in disembodied language, we keep neurally and verbally behaving our old trauma. Yeah. And when I say our old trauma, I basically refer to our history of conditioning with disembodied language. So, as long as I neurally, verbally behave my history of conditioning with disembodied language, I'm expressing stress, worry, fear, distraction, anxiety, chaos, conflict, problems. I sound horrible. I sound stressed. I sound upset. I sound dysregulated. I sound fearful. But when I neurally, verbally express the correct use of language in which I listen to myself while I speak, I express my at-easeness, I express my well-being, I express my clarity, my embodied language, I express my peacefulness, and once I'm done expressing my embodied language, my correct way of using language, I am totally at peace. There's nothing anymore to say, maybe later, but once I have expressed myself to my heart's content, correctly, realistically, skillfully, continuously, completely, what's there left? There's no language inside of me. I don't have a mind. I don't have inner language. The illusion of inner language has been completely dissolved in my embodied language. And the trauma of my disembodied language has been completely dissolved in my embodied language. And yes, also the illusion of an external environment and an internal environment is also completely dissolved. The whole issue of inner and outer, or me versus you, me and the world, it is no longer, that dualism does no longer rear its end, because I have embodied language. I have used my language correctly. And so the description, is the described. What I say about myself, about my individually lived experience, what I say with my embodied language is correct. And everything falls into place, everything fits, and everything works out. The consequences are immediate, instantaneous, because embodied language is self-reinforcing. And as my embodied language continues, I continue to self-reinforce. And if by any chance in the future, maybe at the 4th of July in 2026, on Independence Day, maybe after that date, when Trump has announced the golden era of America to start, or whatever, that's on the 250th birthday of the United States. Maybe if you have, until that time, really taken to heart what I was saying, and you have sort of started to talk with yourself, and you have started to have embodied language. Maybe if you have experienced this self-reinforcing effect that I'm talking about, and you have continued to explore it for yourself on your own, then after that 4th of July, we celebrate that Independence Day together, and we celebrate our ongoing embodied language together, and we will mutually reinforce each other's embodied language and establish ourselves in the language enlightenment, which is our ongoing embodied language. And that will be a joyful cultural shift where people are going to finally recognize the correct way of using language. And the incorrect way of language from then on is completely irrelevant, is just a historical artifact, just like we once believed that the earth was flat, or that disease were created by evil spirits. That was not true. The earth was not the center of the universe, and inner language never existed, and language was always an overt phenomenon. And yes, we can either use our language correctly or we can use it incorrectly. And when we use it correctly, we use our language scientifically, obviously. Even if our correct use of language is only occurring in what they call an N of one, an N of one, a single subject design where one individual is doing the experiment on him or on herself to determine if this difference between correct and incorrect use of language is real. So I look forward to that moment where we mutually reinforce. The social reinforcement will be secondary to the self-reinforcement of our embodied language. The self-reinforcing aspects of our embodied language come first. So you are now, hopefully, due to this video, you are now going to verify if you are able to have your own embodied language instead of your disembodied language. And when you do, you will already immediately feel the relief that I'm talking about, the freedom that I'm talking about, because embodied language is the language of your individual freedom. You're no longer bound by others, by the group, by the collective. You are in embodied language totally on your own. And that is a sense of sovereignty, a sense of it's very pristine, very distinguished, and very sophisticated also. And yet it is totally simple and ordinary. But it is sophisticated in that all of the complications have been dissolved. All of the difficulties, all of the problems have been dissolved. And so you're now able to use your language in your own way correctly.